In the world of medicine, where every decision can change lives, your peace of mind is crucial. This is where Pattern steps in. Imagine insurance made simple, fast, and personalized, just for you. With Pattern, you're not just getting disability and life insurance, you're insuring your future and protecting your greatest asset, your income. In the past 10 years, Pattern has transformed the way over 20,000 doctors secure their financial well-being. Discover the simplicity of securing your future at patternlife.com or click the link in the description. What is the deal with the FTC ruling on non-competes? What applies to physicians? What doesn't? What do we need to worry about? Stay tuned and find out. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, we have a recurring guest. We have Kyle Claussen, who is the CEO of Resolve, and he spent the last decade advocating for physicians in our employment contracts. That's what we talked about last time. So if you have any questions about negotiation, circle back to that last episode. But on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the FTC's ruling on non-competes. Well, a little more about Kyle. Thousands of physicians have utilized Resolve's data, tools, and expertise each year to ensure that they're being treated fairly in their employment contracts. The utmost important, he's married to an ophthalmologist, so he understands us. And he's got 3 kids and a dog. Welcome back to the podcast, Kyle.
Appreciate you having me.
So let's just get the global view, the 10,000-foot view of the FTC's ruling about non-competes.
I think hopefully some of your listeners have heard about this, but the FTC came out a few weeks ago and said, we're going to place a ban on all non-competes, not only non-competes that are going to be entered into, right, in a new contract, but also existing non-competes. Pretty big deal, not just for physicians and healthcare, but, for the entire country. It's getting a lot of attention right now, and I'm glad we're here to talk about it.
What did they have in mind when they were making the ruling, right? They weren't primarily worried about doctors. Certainly we were mentioned in the ruling, but what made this a concern of theirs?
So I think what their overarching theme, right, is that non-competes are detrimental to employees, right? Especially what they're going to call non-senior executives or just kind of the run-of-the-mill employee. If it prevents competition from happening, they did reference physicians, multiple times, but it's not just for physicians, it's for all industries like we talked about. The idea is that this is an unfair restraint on trade, right, which is what the FTC is there to govern. They're utilizing their authority in that manner. We'll see if that holds up, right? We can talk about that here too, but that's where this thing is starting.
All right. They want the free flow of commerce, and this is preventing that. This is preventing fair competition.
Correct.
I mean, it's a non-compete. It's in the name. Just for some clarification, what's the difference between like a restrictive covenant, a non-compete, and a non-solicit?
Yeah, so I think restrictive covenants is kind of like the overarching term for all those things, right? So it just means a promise that you're making to somebody else to not do something, right? So non-solicitations, right? I'm not going to go out and solicit client list or patient list if I leave. Non-disparagement, I'm not going to talk badly about you, right? You're not going to talk badly about me. And then non-competes, right, also fall into this where it's I'm not going to go out and establish a competing business. I'm not going to practice medicine, right, for physicians within a certain area for a certain amount of time. And so when you see the term restrictive covenants, it's kind of an overarching umbrella, right, that covers all 3 of those categories. I think it is important to note the FTC is only weighing in on non-competes. They're not weighing in on non-solicitations or other trademark, kind of protections. It's just about letting you work somewhere post-termination.
Okay. So then it doesn't cover non-solicits. So if we're like, oh, we're finally going to be free of these non-competes, if we still have non-solicits in the contract, what do we still need to be concerned about?
A non-compete means you can't go practice medicine, right? And they're saying, you're no longer allowed to prevent them from doing that, right? You should be able to move wherever you want to. Non-solicitations, though, means you're not supposed to send out, right, information to your patients or to your client list if you're not a physician saying, I'm next door, come utilize my services over here, right? Instead of with the current business that you're seeking treatment from or, getting business from. So they're still leading and giving some protections back to the existing businesses, but they're also not preventing you from working. So it's a little bit of a, kind of splitting the issue, right, on unrestricted covenants overall and trying to give both a little bit of extra protection.
So if I'm a new doctor, I can join a practice, an established practice, might be a small practice. I will build up a following. And then once I have a big following, I'll leave and move across the street. And my patients will be able to find me because I'm nearby. I mean, I think the original reason why this was created for physicians was to prevent that from happening. But now it looks like I might be able to do this.
Maybe. The rule went into effect or was issued, but it's not effective until September. So there's a 120-day kind of waiting period. So as of today, anybody listening to this right now, you're not able to walk across the street, in that example just yet. There are also multiple legal challenges that have come out. And so it's likely, I think, in my opinion, that they're going to delay, that until some of these cases work themselves through. If it stands, and if you're underneath the FTC's authority, which means you're in a for-profit private practice or for-profit entity, this applies to you. And then there's the whole nonprofit piece that's, has a little more gray area to it.
Yeah. And I definitely want to flesh that out a little more. And I just use that example to play kind of devil's advocate where it does kind of make sense to have a non-compete, right? Like, so if I've spent a time building a practice, you come in as a new associate, build up a following, and then leave and directly compete with me, that, that kind of hurts commerce in some way. But a lot of what we're seeing now is you've got these big hospital systems, they're overflowing with patients, but they've now handcuffed you to them because you are not allowed to leave, or you have to leave, you live near the hospital. And so now you've got to practice somewhere that's really far from home. And so you're less likely to do that. So then in that way, it's inhibiting commerce. So I think that's what they're trying to prevent, correct?
Yeah. I mean, when you think commerce, big picture commerce, that's true. I think when you talk about healthcare specifically, I mean, there's such a shortage of physicians that most markets, even if you do what you just said, you walk across the street, there's usually more patients than there are physicians, in a certain area. And so I think from a public policy standpoint, and whether healthcare should be something different than just a normal business practice, I think they probably consider that as well. But because this is so broad, it's hitting everything.
So you had mentioned that there were specific references to physicians in the ruling. What did they specifically have to say about us?
Over 150. So first of all, the ruling is
okay. Maybe not all of them.
There's 570 pages of stuff there, but there's over 150 references to physicians. When they first issued this, potential rule about a year ago, it obviously received a ton of feedback, from both the hospitals and from physicians individually. And so there's a lot of this context, and kind of, pros and cons of the sides discussed in there. Some of the commentary talked about whether or not the FTC had enough expertise to apply rules like this to healthcare. They were very adamant about that they had a long history in working with healthcare and antitrust issues and things like that. And so felt like they were pretty confident on weighing in on this. They also talk about positions specifically when we get into some of the exceptions, like the senior executive exception and what that means, how certain positions, if you're in a private practice, you're a partner, you're going to act like an executive in that situation versus if you're just working for large health system, you have no decision-making authority at all, and how you wouldn't be considered a senior executive in those situations. So lots of references, lots of examples throughout there, but they absolutely meant this for healthcare and for physicians.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the senior executives, because, it might be a way also to get them to kind of trap us. Like they might be able to put something in the language of our contract such that we are then identified as a senior executive, even though we might not have much decision-making power or leverage. It works to their advantage, but not to ours. So what do we need to know about that part so that we can't be taken advantage of? Leading a medical practice is challenging. There can be reimbursement changes, referral slowdowns, staff turnover, or drama. There are obstacles in the way of achieving your goals, or maybe it feels like you've hit a plateau. Who can you turn to for help with the business of managing a medical practice? The Physician Growth Accelerator, a private practice partner that helps you uncover and overcome constraints in your practice. They will check your business vitals, identify the root cause of what's restricting your growth, prescribe what to do about it, and help you achieve it, just like we do with our patients. Imagine your practice, where stress is reduced, profits increase, in both patients and staff, and you are happier. They've been making that vision a reality for over a decade. Isn't it time your practice thrived? Discover how at physiciangrowthaccelerator.com.
Just to back up for just 1 second. The general rule is they can't apply non-competes, They're trying to wipe them out. There's an exception to that rule that says if you're a senior executive, you can still have a non-compete in place, Those are people that have high levels of knowledge and maybe incentives, where these things are going to be allowed. And so the question is are physicians considered senior executives or not? Senior executives has two prongs to it. One, you have to make more than 151,000 and some change per year, which most physicians do. So you check that box very easily.
By the way, if you don't, you got to call Kyle to go over your contract because that's what he does every day. So he needs to help you make sure that you are in that area.
So once you check that box, you have to be in a policy-making position, right? Which means you have authority to make large, high-level decisions about the direction of the business. Most physicians, again, don't check that prong. And that's what the FTC is weighing in on, saying there are some physicians for sure that are CEOs that are going to be in high-level positions, but most are not, right, in the current setting.
Right. So if you're in the C-suite, if you're the CMO or the CMIO, right, then it applies to you. But if you're on a committee, that's not enough decision-making power to really collect that box.
Right. And I think what you're going to want to be careful of is that if this rule does apply, right, and it is upheld, that your contract doesn't somehow use language that starts to look like you're a senior executive, even if you're not, right? You don't want to walk yourself into an exception to that rule.
But then they'd also have to include the non-compete. It's not like there is, like they would have to include the non-compete and that senior executive language. They couldn't just like pull a fast one on you.
That's right. It has to be both. Yeah.
So you talked about earlier the fact that some hospitals are not-for-profit and some are, and it doesn't apply to not-for-profit. If I remember correctly, it's because the FTC is supposed to regulate commerce. And if you're a non-for-profit, you're not supposed to be moving commerce. You're just supposed to be taking care of patients, not like moving lots of money. What's happening there?
58% roughly of all the hospitals in this country have nonprofit status. And so as a general rule, the FTC doesn't have authority over those 58%. But in, again, this decision by the FTC, they come out and they say that a lot of those, maybe not a lot, some of those is the more accurate way to frame it. Hospitals kind of look, act, and feel like for-profit entities, right? The IRS has had cases on this where if you've ceded control to for-profit arms or wings, or if you start to look like this, that you can lose that status. They say that there's some portion of the 58% that are going to be subject to the rule. The problem, I think, for most physicians is that they don't tell you which ones, right? Yeah. So it's still going to be kind of this fact and circumstance analysis of what your situation is, how hard you want to push on that issue, things like that. And I do think there's competing interests on both sides of this. I'm interested in how it plays out. Really going to take that stance and then potentially lose out on some of that public student loan forgiveness that they like. Right? Because you can't have them both at the same time. And then also the health systems, if they really want to put these non-competes in, then potentially lose a challenge and then lose their nonprofit status, which they like, right? So it's you kind of got to pick your points on this as far as how aggressive and how strongly you want to come in on that.
Wow. Unforeseen. I didn't see that coming at all, where you'd then lose your student loan advantage because you're no longer working for a not-for-profit. Or would they allow them to keep their not-for-profit status, but they would just say, listen, the FTC ruling applies to you too?
Yeah, I think we're all guessing at that. A logical conclusion would be is that if they're non-for-profit, you can't have any of the other non-for-profit benefits either, right?
Got it. So are there any industries that have contested this? Or I think maybe I should rephrase the question to make it a little easier to answer. Like, are there any industries that haven't contested this? Because it seems like it's not just about healthcare. And I think it may have started with like a sandwich shop. I think I read somewhere there was like a sandwich shop. That's where the original lawsuit came from. They were like non-competes. Like if you're going to work for Jersey Subs, you can't work for Subway sandwiches and then like a 20-mile radius.
Pretty much all employers, right, don't like this, right? They have agreements in place, right? They want to keep them there. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out. Their suit is actually being, kind of delayed, right? Because there's another company that's already filed before them that has almost the exact same issues called Ryan Company, which is a, kind of a tax and consulting firm out of Texas. So I don't think there's anyone that's not upset about it. The hospital association certainly has weighed in, and there's public comment from them on how bad they think this is for healthcare. So I think we're going to have to wait and see on this. But I do think it's a great step in the right direction for physicians and for that free agency if it does stay in place.
Tell us a little about the legal aspects of it, because the FTC rule, it's a rule, it's not a law. So like, how does this legally carry any weight?
Well, so Congress gives the FTC authority to act. And so that's one of the biggest legal challenge that's coming in, is that this is beyond the scope, right, of what Congress gave authority to do. And so we're going to find out on that topic of whether or not court thinks that this is okay. If they do, I don't think it's the one and done, type of thing. I think it's if they have the authority, then it's the question of, can there be carve-outs? Can there be other challenges to this? I don't think this is a quick outcome, but I do think in the next year or two, we'll have some direction on it.
Okay. So that's the timeline that we're looking at. We're not looking at weeks or months. We're looking at a year or two.
Yeah, if there was no legal challenges, you'd be looking at months, right? I mean, that's the September date. But I mean, with these challenges in place, I think you're looking at more of a year or two at least, kind of position on this before we know how it shakes out.
So then, since it came out, has there been any change? Like, what have you learned between when it came out and now?
So we've had some employers already take their non-competes out, right? Where they're just saying, hey, this is the direction it's going. We don't want to mess with it, whether it's upheld or whether it's not. So we're going to take this thing of our contracts. We may put in some other language that's, ties your hands a little bit. Their non-solicits are a little stronger than they used to be because those are, allowed underneath the rule. Some employers trying to lock in longer terms. So it used to be that everybody was kind of on these at-will employment, right? You can terminate at any time. We've seen a few contracts come back that are now 2 or 3 years trying to lock you in. So that's a breach of contract if you leave early. So I think there's going to be other people will find a way, right, to try to work around this rule. But it still puts you in a position of having some negotiating power at some point in time, even if it is a year or two down the road. Whereas right now, you never regain it. Once you sign the contract, you're really tying your hands unless you were okay leaving that geographic area, which most physicians are not.
I mean, for those who are finishing residency, finishing fellowship, changing a job that doesn't have a non-compete, so they're able to leave,
Right.
What advice would you have for them?
Well, I think the same as it was before, right? This ruling that you can't rely on the rule at all right now. You need to attack your contract with the same energy and focus that you would have before, making sure you're taking out provisions that are bad, because even non-competes have been banned for a while in some states, right? Like California has had a ban in place for a while for physicians on them. And we still see employers drop in non-competes in those documents, even though the law doesn't allow for it, because they just think that people, one, won't understand that, and two, will question whether or not they can, right, challenge it. I still just think you want the document in your contract, especially if you're coming out of training, to fit your situation and to be legitimate for what you need and want. For us, as of today, it doesn't change a thing.
And just to plug my own practice, we don't have non-competes. We took them out because we're awesome. And if you join us, you're not going to want to leave. Like that's how strongly we feel about our practice. That's another, make your workplace a place that people aren't going to want to leave. And then you don't have to worry about them putting up a shingle across the street because they're not going to want to.
The FTC actually said that. They said there's other ways to retain people, right? A lot of those are more positive. So I think you guys are doing a great job.
And then I'm not going to hold you to it. We're not going to go to this in a future episode and say, this is where Kyle was wrong. But what are your predictions for the future?
I think there is a lot of money behind wanting this to go away. Anytime there's that many people lobbying for something to have adjustment to it, I don't know that they'll wipe out the ban entirely, but I think you're going to see some modifications to this. I don't know exactly how that shakes out for physicians. I think healthcare is such a unique space that there's really good arguments, right, on both sides, right, of this, but mostly on the physician side.
Kyle, don't take their side.
Here's the only position I'm going to take for a health system, right? And this is rare for me. If you've had a contract that's been in place, right, and both sides came to an agreement on it, to go backwards in time is really unique for any law, right? We don't retroactively go back in time usually with changes. And that's the one that I question just from a legal precedent standpoint of whether they'll be able to keep that in effect.
So if we are in that situation where we're switching jobs, we're changing jobs, we're thinking about getting another job, we need someone to review our contracts with us, where do people find you?
Yeah, resolve.com. We'd be happy to help. This is what we do. It's our specialty. Just like physicians, right? All attorneys specialize in something. This is what we do. So resolve.com, we'd be happy to help.
Well, Kyle Claussen, thank you so much for being back on the podcast. And thanks for all you do to help physicians.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Doctors dedicate our lives to caring for others. It's time someone took care of us. Visit patternlife.com to simplify your path to peace of mind. Patternlife.com, simplifying your insurance journey. Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you, this is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice or financial advice or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.